Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to address you this evening. As David mentioned, my interest areas are both constitutional law and corporate governance, both of which seem to be firmly on the agenda, I think, for the duration of the McGill summer programme. What I want to talk to you about this evening is the governance failures in our financial institutions and some of the changes that I think we need to face up to going forward. That is not as distant a theme from political reform as it may seem, because I think one of the common problems with reforming any type of system, whether it's a political system or whether it's a governance regime, is that reform from the top alone won't actually change the way in which business is done, whether that's the business of politics or the business of business. And I think one of the things we can see clearly from both the Honihan and the Watson-Regling reports into the financial crisis is we've had a culture of, I suppose, denial and a culture of weak regulation of business interests. And without changing that fundamental culture, I don't think there's really any hope that any amount of legislative change is going to really amend the problems which led us to where we are today. The Honihan and Watson-Regling reports point out, as the first speaker has said, that the problems in our financial system and the situation we're in today are not caused by some abstract global catastrophe that happened across the water. We know now that those problems were homegrown, that they were contributed to by a number of different factors, and that the government undoubtedly are going to bear some of the responsibility for that. But what I want to do is I want to sort of unpack some of the misconceptions about what we did have in place and what we didn't have in place in terms of governance and regulation in the run-up to the current financial crisis. And the first thing I want to point out is that, contrary to what a lot of people may believe, it's not the case that we didn't have rules or standards. We had plenty of rules and standards. Some of them were legal requirements and some of them were sort of guides to how business should be conducted. The problem is that in the good times, we didn't see the need to enforce them. And in particular, when times were good and the economy was buoyant, the regulator and the financial regulator has been singled out for particular criticism in both reports, acted in a way that really suggested that there was no need to have any regard to those rules and regulations, that they are rules and regulations which could be bent or ignored in times of profitability. And we now know that that was a huge mistake, hopefully one that won't be repeated. But I think that it's one that will only be prevented from recurring again if we address the fundamental sort of culture of denial in terms of the breaches of regulation that appears to have been around at the time. So it's not the case that we had gaps, massive gaps in our company law, although there is one gap that I think is worth pointing out, because I think it illustrates a sort of a valuable lesson about reform and the kind of company law and bank reform that we're going to have over the next few years and that we've already started this past summer. And that is the gap in the Companies Act 1990, which facilitated the bed and breakfast arrangement at Anglo-Irish Bank. So everybody is familiar with this. This was the arrangement whereby monies were loaned to the CEO and chairman of the bank, were artificially inserted back into the accounts for a sort of a snapshot that made the bank look more healthy than it was, only to be withdrawn again. And the reason that that was possible was because the 1990 Companies Act, which brought in rules about directors' loans being disclosed in the annual reports, had an exemption for banks in subsection 6 of section 41, and I promise I won't talk too much about sections of legislation. But the reason I'm mentioning it to you is if you go back and look at the Dole debates about the 1990 Companies Act, we know that around that time, when the legislation was brought in, there must have been some discussion about why this exemption was given, but there's no record of it in the Dole debates. We don't know why that exemption was given. We do know that the Irish Bankers' Federation made a lot of submissions about the 1990 Act in general because they're referred to quite a number of times in the Dole debates, but we have no explanation of why that massive gap was left in our company law. And I think that's a lesson going forward, and I know the government is currently in the process, hopefully, of promulgating the new or passing the new Companies Consolidation Act. And I think it really is a time for going through the legislation with a fine-tooth comb, because it's interesting that the Company Law Review Group, which was supposed to be looking at our company law, identifying things we should be changing as part of the preparatory work for that Act, didn't point out this massive loophole, which we now know has had a hugely damaging effect on our confidence in our banks. Regulation and sort of reform of company law are always reactions to crises, and that's nothing controversial in that. So, for example, the Wall Street crash led to massive reform legislation in the United States. The collapse of BCCI, for example, and Robert Maxwell's empire in the late 1980s and early 1990s led to company law reform in the United Kingdom. It also reflexively actually led to the 1990 Act in this jurisdiction. And we've also had a number of other crises which have led to different sort of regulatory measures as a reaction to that. Obviously, knee-jerk reactions are never a good idea. You always need a time of reflection, and that isn't always possible when you're dealing with systemic threats, for example, to the banking sector. But nonetheless, it's true to say that it's almost always the case that we only care about regulation and corporate governance reform as sort of a public issue that receives media attention when we've had some kind of economic crisis. And in the good times, those matters seem to just disappear from the agenda, and nobody is really too interested in discussing them. And I think that's something that has to change. The weaknesses in regulation and in the sort of oversight function of a central bank have been discussed many, many times in the media. I'm not going to repeat what's said in the Honihan and Watson Regling reports here, except to point out that to the extent that the financial regulator has come in for serious criticism, I think a lot of that is justified. But I think the systemic problems with the way in which the central bank was constituted in the legislation undoubtedly contributed to that, and that's something that Honihan points out. So the central bank was on the one hand supposed to be supervising the banking industry, sanctioning breaches of rules, and generally keeping an eye and monitoring risk in the banks. But at the same time, they were also supposed to be promoting the financial services industry, and those two items should never really appear on the same agenda. That has been recognised now to a certain extent. So the new central bank reform bill, which is going to completely change the way in which the central bank's regulatory aspects are structured and sort of separate them out from any sort of promotion of the financial services industry, is to be welcomed. It hasn't passed through the Senate yet, but it passed through the Dáil last week. So I think that's a welcome reform. One of the big issues in corporate governance globally at the moment is the role that can be played by institutional investors. And the reason I want to mention that is they haven't received a huge amount of attention in the media in this jurisdiction. So all of our banking institutions, our large credit institutions, of course, have institutional investors. And one of the things institutional investors are supposed to do is to question and test how banks are being managed, because after all, they're there in a sort of a stewardship role in terms of their own investees. So managing your money, whether it's your pension or your insurance, whatever it might be, they should be constantly asking questions of the institutions in which they invest. And there seems to have been a complete abdication of that duty by our institutional investors. So, for example, one of the key principles in the Combined Code on Corporate Governance, which is sort of a set of best practice rules which all Irish listed companies, including banks, have to sign up to if they want to be quoted on the Irish Stock Exchange, is that the two key roles in large companies of the chief executive officer and the chairman of the board should always be distinct. And the idea is that by joining those two, you give too much power to one individual and too much potential for abuse of that power. And we know now that that has in fact taken place in one of our credit institutions. And when the decision was made to make one individual the CEO and chairman of that particular credit institution, the Irish Association of Investment Managers, which was consulted about its view on it, basically said that they were not going to object to it. They initially said that they would like to see a deputy chairman introduced as some sort of a check on that unbridled power in the hands of one individual, but then they later on simply dropped that and never questioned it again. And that raises serious questions about the role of institutional investors. It's not just an abstract problem, and it's not just an Irish problem. So, for example, the financial reporting body in the United Kingdom has recently published a large report setting out principles for institutional investors, active engagement of institutional investors with the institutions in which they place other people's monies. And those principles will presumably, if the Combined Code is anything to go by, be adopted, at least in theory, in this jurisdiction. But whether or not institutional investors are really willing to devote the time and energy to monitoring the companies and banks in which they're putting our money is an open question. But as I said, institutional investors have received virtually no criticism, public criticism, in the wake of the banking crisis, and that seems to me to be an oversight. The other elephant in the room when it comes to the banking crisis is the position of the auditors in this jurisdiction. And one of the terrible and sort of sad things, I think, about the current situation is that, in fact, the role of auditors and auditor failure was something with which we in this country are all too familiar with. So after the Dirt inquiry, it was very clear that the accounting profession could not be trusted to self-regulate, could not be trusted to ask the questions or even simply perform simple checks on the activities of our banks. And nonetheless, a decision was made in 2003, around the same time the decision was made to set up the financial regulator, to set up an oversight body, an overseeing body for the accounting profession, which conducts audits of our large credit institutions and listed companies. And that oversight body was set up in such a way as to make it what I would describe as a regulator once removed. So the IASA, which is the body charged with overseeing the auditing profession and the accounting profession generally, doesn't actually have any direct regulatory powers, so to speak, over individual audit providers. All it does is regulate the way in which the four self-regulating accounting bodies regulate their own members. And it's interesting that in its annual report, which was just published there a couple of weeks ago, that the chairman of the IASA pointed out that the body is completely under-resourced. It doesn't have appropriate powers to enable it to conduct any kind of meaningful regulation. And furthermore, and I think this is really indicative of the sort of culture of denial and sort of the lack of engagement with regulation in this country, two of the accounting profession positions on the board have never been filled because the associations have never been able to agree on sending anybody to go and sit on that committee. And that to me is a real sign that the regulatory functions of that body are just not even taken remotely seriously by the accounting profession. And I think that the Commission to inquire into the banking crisis has mentioned the audit function as one area of focus. And I actually think that that is going to be one of the most important areas of focus, and it's going to be one of the most important reform items that's going to come out of the banking inquiry, because we simply have to deal with the situation whereby we're not regulating the audit function whatsoever. And I think it's a really serious issue, and I think it's one that should be centre stage in any reform of our governance structures in this country. That's all I really have to say about the issue. If anybody has any questions, I think we're taking them at the end of the panel discussion. So I'd just like to thank you very much for your time.